by Milton, Friedman on Capitalism. The name is Capitalism and Freedom. It is the 40th edition, anniversary edition, with a new preface. Milton Friedman, University of Chicago Press. So here we go. The book is really interesting, the way he writes. I'm just going to read a little from the introduction. So he writes, in a much quoted passage in his inaugural address, President Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." The paternalistic "what your country can do for you" implies that government is the patron, the citizen the ward. What you can do for your country implies the government is the master, the citizen, the servant, or the votary. So, to the free man, he writes, like you can read, to the free man, the country is the collection of individuals who compose it, not something over and above them. He goes on to write, a free man will ask neither what his country can do for him or what he can do for his country. He will ask rather, what can I and my compatriots do through government to help us discharge our individual responsibilities, to achieve our several goals and purposes, and above all, to protect our freedom. And he will accompany this question with another: how can we keep the government we create from becoming a Frankenstein that will destroy the very freedom we established it to protect? Freedom is a rare and delicate plant. Our minds tell us, and history confirms, that the great threat to freedom is the concentration of power. Government is necessary to preserve our freedom. It is an instrument through which we can exercise our freedom. Yet, by concentrating power in political hands, it is also a threat to freedom. Even though the men who wield this power initially be of good will, and even though they be not corrupted by the power they exercise, the power will both attract and form men of a different stamp. So the question is, how can we benefit from the promise of government while avoiding the threat to freedom? Two broad principles embodied in our Constitution give an answer that has preserved our freedom so far, though they have been violated repeatedly in practice while proclaimed as precept. First, the scope of government must be limited. Its major function must be to protect our freedom both from the enemies outside our gates and from our fellow citizens, to preserve law and order, to enforce private contracts, to foster competitive markets. Beyond this major function, government may enable us at times to accomplish jointly what we would find it more difficult or expensive to accomplish severally. However, any such use of government is fraught with danger. We should not and cannot avoid using government in this way. But there should be a clear and large balance of advantages before we do. By relying primarily on voluntary cooperation and private enterprise in both economic and other activities, we can ensure that the private sector is a check on the powers of the governmental sector and an effective protection of freedom of speech, of religion, and of thought. And the second broad principle is that government power must be dispersed. If government is to exercise power, better in the country than in the state, better in the county, that means provinces, than in the state, better in the state than in Washington, If I do not like what my local community does, be it in sewage disposal or schools, I can move to another local community. And though few may take this step, the mere possibility acts as a check. If I do not like what my state does, I can move to another. If I do not like what Washington imposes, I have few alternatives in this world of jealous nations. The very difficulty of avoiding the enactments of the federal government is, of course, the great attraction of centralization to many of its proponents. It will enable them more effectively, they believe, to legislate programs that, as they see it, are in the interest of the public, whether it be the transfer of income from the rich to the poor or from private to governmental purposes. They are in a sense right, but this coin has two sides. The power to do good is also the power to do harm. Those who control the power today may not tomorrow, and more important, what one man regards as good, another may regard as harm. The great tragedy of the drive to centralization, as of the drive to extend the scope of governments in general, is that it is mostly led by men of goodwill who will be the first to rue its consequences. The preservation of freedom is the protective reason for limiting and decentralizing governmental power. But there is also a constructive reason. The great advances of civilization, whether in architecture or painting, in science or literature, in industry or agriculture, have never come from centralized government. Columbus did not set out to seek a new route to China in response to a majority directive of a parliament, though he was partly financed by an absolute monarch. Newton, Einstein, Shakespeare, Milton, Edison, Ford, Jane Addams. No one of these opened new frontiers in human knowledge and understanding. In literature, in technical possibilities, or in the relief of human misery in response to government directives. Their achievements were the product of individual genius, of strongly held minority views of a social climate permitting variety and diversity. Government can never duplicate the variety and diversity of individual action at any moment in time by imposing uniform standards in housing or nutrition or clothing. Government could undoubtedly improve the level of living of many individuals by imposing uniform standards in schooling, road construction or sanitation. Central government could undoubtedly improve the level of performance in many local areas and perhaps even on the average of all communities, but in the process, government would replace progress by stagnation. It would substitute uniform mediocrity for the variety essential for that experimentation which can bring tomorrow's laggards above today's mean. Capitalism and Freedom, that is, this book discusses some of these great issues. Its major theme is the role of competitive capitalism, the organization of the bulk of economic activity through private enterprise operating in a free market as a system of economic freedom and a necessary condition for political freedom. Its minor theme is the role that government should play in a society dedicated to freedom and relying primarily on the market to organize economic activity. The first two chapters deal with these issues on an abstract level in terms of principles rather than concrete application. The later chapters apply these principles to a variety of particular problems. An abstract statement can conceivably be complete and exhaustive, though this ideal is certainly far from realized in the two chapters that follow. The application of the principles cannot even conceivably be exhaustive. Each day brings new problems and new circumstances. That is why the role of the state can never be spelled out once and for all in terms of specific functions. It is also why we need from time to time to re-examine the bearings of what we hope are unchanged principles on the problems of the day. Okay, so we go on. He writes, it is extremely convenient to have a label for the political and economic viewpoint elaborated in this book. The rightful and the proper label is liberalism. Unfortunately, as a supreme, if unintended, complement, the enemies of the system of private enterprise have thought it wise to appropriate its label. So that's written by Joseph Schumpeter, like it's given out here. Just go through that. So he's borrowed it from there. So, unfortunately, as a supreme, if unintended, complement, the enemies of the system of private enterprise have thought it wise to appropriate its label, so that liberalism has in the United States come to have a very different meaning than it did in the 19th century or does today over much of the continent of Europe. As it developed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the intellectual movement that went under the name of liberalism emphasized freedom as the ultimate goal and the individual as the ultimate entity in the society. It supported laissez-faire at home as a means of reducing the role of the state in economic affairs and thereby enlarging the role of the individual. It supported free trade abroad as a means of linking the nations of the world together peacefully and democratically. In political matters, it supported the development of representative government and of parliamentary institutions, reduction in the arbitrary power of the state, and protection of the civil freedoms of individuals. Beginning in the late 19th century and especially after 1930 in the United States, the term liberalism came to be associated with a very different emphasis, particularly in economic policy. It came to be associated with a readiness to rely primarily on the state rather than on private voluntary arrangements to achieve objectives regarded as desirable. The catchwords became welfare and equality rather than freedom. The 19th century liberal regarded an extension of freedom as the most effective way to promote welfare and equality. The 20th century liberal regards welfare and equality as either prerequisites or an alternative to freedom. In the name of welfare and equality, the 20th century liberal has come to favor the revival of the very policies of state intervention and paternalism, against which classical liberalism fought. In the very act of turning the clock back to 17th century mercantilism, he is fond of castigating true liberals as reactionary. Because of the corruption of the term liberalism, the views that formerly went under that name are now often labeled conservatism. But this is not a satisfactory alternative. The 19th century liberal was a radical both in the etymological sense of going to the root of the matter and in the political sense of favoring major changes in social institutions. So too must be his modern heir. We do not wish to conserve the state interventions that have interfered so greatly with our freedom, though of course we do wish to conserve those that have promoted it. Moreover, in practice, the terms conservatism has come to cover so wide a range of views and views so incompatible with one another that we shall no doubt see the growth of hyphenated designations such as libertarian, conservative, and aristocratic conservative. So he writes then, partly because of my reluctance to surrender the term to proponents of measures that would destroy liberty, partly because I cannot find a better alternative, I shall resolve these difficulties by using the word liberalism in its original sense as the doctrines pertaining to a free man, he says.